this is Caral, and lots of pyramids, second known civilization after the first one was discovered in Mesopotamia. And it looks like there was a flood here. Water came down from that side and flowed through the middle of Caral in the Supé Valley and washed away a portion of it. The flood also covered up all the pyramids, and what we have now is mounds like the ones to the right that are now being excavated. There are 25 sites that are like this along the Supé Valley, and work has just begun on 17 of those. So I'm walking around Caral, and this is a site in the valley of the Supé River. Very arid, and it's about 450 feet above sea level according to my barometer here. But looks like there are 7 pyramids and 2 undiscovered ones which are way back there, and that comes to a total of about 9 pyramids, including 2 undiscovered ones. Undiscovered being kind of like this mound here, which is being cleared, and it's taken 25 years to reveal all the other pyramids that they've discovered here. But if it's true that there are 9, then I took a look at the Pleiades Cluster, and at each end of the Pleiades star cluster there are 2 binaries. Okay, a binary is basically 2 stars revolving around each other, and if you put 5 in the middle, 2 binaries at each end, that gives us a total of 9. So I'm going to create a theory here that it's possible that Caral, which is the second oldest civilization discovered after Mesopotamia, is potentially shaped like the Pleiades cluster. If this is true, and it matches the cluster of pyramids in Egypt, which is structured after the belt of Orion and the Orion constellation, then that means that there's probably a relation between how Caral was architected and how the Egyptian pyramid complex was architected.
En cuanto al techo, las pirámides eran abiertas, recuerdan que era para fines religiosos, viviendas sí, posiblemente con vegetales, caña brava, junco, totora y lo más tierra.
Pero se encuentra, en el interior se encuentra así como cuando hay lluvia para
No, es que acá es un clima seco, claro que el clima es seco, pero no llueve. Estamos en invierno, pero tenemos presencia de sol, y así es todos los días. Imagínate el verano.
Now let's examine the similarity between Caral Supé's site architecture and my theory of how it was potentially modeled after the Pleiades cluster. As seen at the left, the site architecture is shown at the UNESCO World Heritage Site, where there's a diagram that depicts the major structures that have been discovered so far in Caral Supé. And this has a striking similarity to how Pleiades as a star cluster looks today. So I went and took a look at some pictures on Wikipedia, and I found that the current view of Pleiades actually shows the two binaries at both ends, and those are shown on the center left and upper right of the picture on the right. And then there are 5 other stars that make up a total of 9 stars. And the trick here is to figure out whether the site architecture actually resembled what Pleiades looked like around 5,000 years ago. So what I did next was to take a look at the details of the Pleiades cluster, and there's potential for additional research there. In particular, if we look at the brighter 5 stars and the distances between them, as well as the brightness, then we could potentially do some archaeological research in terms of the distances between the pyramidal structures and the various other buildings on site at Caral Supé, and also the size of each building, and see if there are correlations between the distances between the stars in Pleiades, as well as the brightness indicative of potentially the size of the pyramids. So, that's an area of research that potentially would need funding. And I don't know if the current archaeological group that's working on site has that funding to support this kind of work. They're too busy basically removing sand and discovering the artifacts that are buried underneath the sand on site. One of the things that's striking here is that the site architecture shows a circular pit underneath one of the larger pyramids, and that circular pit actually resembles one of the nebulae on the lower part of the Pleiades cluster, and it's even visible today. The next thing I want to talk about is, the fact that there's background stars that are transiting across from the main Pleiades star cluster. And these might be transiting, or the star cluster itself may be transiting in front of the smaller stars. But, the point here is Galileo had drawn a string of stars that go through the middle of the cluster, whereas the site architecture shows a string of stars that's actually on the lower part of the structure. So, if we can find out whether Pleiades actually looked like the site back in 3000 BC, which is 5,000 years ago, then we may have some correlation between the fact that, the stars were transiting from top to bottom as we go further into the past. So here's a correlation between the string of stars visible in the site architecture today and in Galileo's diagram. So now finally, if we start looking at the back-computed view of the proper position based on astronomical calculations for Pleiades in 3000 BC, then it starts to become very evident how Pleiades looked and how the string of stars that are transiting amongst the major stars within Pleiades appeared 3,000 years ago. And when I back computed that to 3000 BC and circled the main stars in the Pleiades cluster, there's an obvious visual correlation between how Pleiades looked 3,000 years ago and how the site was architected. So, this again confirms that they were architecting the site based on what they were seeing in the night sky above them. So, as above, so below is a site architecture philosophy that has been evidenced in the pyramid complex at Giza, and now we are seeing it in Caral Supé. This is actually indicative of similar site architecture philosophies between the site architects at the Giza pyramid, potentially even the site architecture correlating Angkor Wat and Draco, as well as Caral Supé and Pleiades.